Okay, so hi everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Organizations in COVID-19, Embodiment, Ethics, and Lockdown. I'm Kate Kenny, I'm Professor of Business and Society here at NUI Galway School of Business and Economics and a member of the Whitaker Institute and the Work, Organization and Society Research Cluster. I'm really excited to be hosting this session today. I'm very pleased to introduce our four speakers. So our first speaker today is Alison Pullen. Alison is Professor of Management and Organisation Studies at Macquarie University, Australia, and Otto Monstad Visiting Professor at Copenhagen Business School's Department of Organisation. Her scholarship focuses on analysing and intervening in the politics of work as it concerns gender discrimination, identity politics, and organisational injustice. She's written widely on these topics, including recent books, journal articles, and Alison's joint editor-in-chief of Gender, Work and Organisation and an associate editor of Organisation Journal. Our second speaker then is Carl Rhodes, a Professor of Organisation Studies and Deputy Dean at University of Technology, Sydney Business School. His research investigates the ethical and political dimensions of management and leadership. Carl's work focuses on the idea of disturbing business ethics, arguing for a political lens to be placed on this field of scholarship, drawing, for example, on the work of Emmanuel Levinas. More broadly, querying the relationship between corporations, management logics, and society. Our third speaker is Ian Munro, Professor of Leadership and Organisation at Newcastle Business School. Ian's primary research interests concern the application of Michel Foucault's concepts and methods to the process of organisation, including a focus on biopolitics. He's written on information warfare in business, with a focus on strategies of control and resistance, and is currently investigating the effects of new techniques of information warfare associated with the WikiLeaks network, hacktivism, and whistleblowing, and he's recently published on these topics, among others. Our final speaker then today is Professor Mariana Fataki, Professor of Business Ethics at Warwick Business School. Mariana holds degrees in medicine, health economics, and a PhD in public policy from the LSE. Mariana is the present senior editor for Organisation Studies, and her research interests are in the area of markets, consumerism, and leadership in public services, gender and ethics of diversity in organizations, and business ethics, the impact of business and society with a focus on institutional corruption. She has also written widely on these topics. So we have a range of speakers from different parts of the world. We are coming from Ireland. This focus is on the role of organizations and the issues of ethics and embodiment in light of the COVID-19 pandemic and the resulting changes to social life and to work. Obviously, this pandemic has had different impacts in different parts of the world, and these are some of the things that we'll be talking about. So before I introduce my first speaker, just a couple of issues around what we'll be doing today. First of all, a recording will be made and sent to those who've signed up, and we'd like to hear from you during this webinar. So if you have a question for any of our speakers, please use the Q&A function on the Zoom. We'll be answering questions at the end of the session, and we'll try and get to as many as possible. So to kick things off, I just want to welcome Professor Alison Pullen. Alison, over to you.
Thanks, Kate, and sincere thanks for the invitation, and my thanks are extended to those at the Whitaker Institute for organising. Today I sit at home on Gadigal land, part of the Eora Nation, and recognise that I'm a foreigner on this land, the land where I gave birth to my son almost 13 years ago. I pay my respects to elders past and present and extend my respect to any First Nations people here today. In the 20th anniversary preface of Talking Up to the White Woman, Aileen Moreton Robinson offers wisdom on the global pandemic that continues to take the lives of so many. She speaks, "Those of us who survive are left to deal with loss, grief, and fear. We are facing an invisible enemy that socially and physically isolates the living and the dead. A virus that has debilitated economies in the space of a few months. Biology has confounded politics, and economies reminding us of our vulnerability as a species. Social distancing provides the only sense of reassurance that mediates the fraught, painful, and often difficult situation humans face at this moment in history. A moment we share with Mother Earth, who is showing signs of recovery across land, sea, water, and air. Global noise and pollution reduction in the ocean and land has allowed our non-human relatives to reap the benefits of human containment and inactivity. Birds are chirping, whales are singing, and Mother Earth is recuperating. My hope is that the significance of this moment speaks to and is understood by humans, but I fear that any introspection gain will be lost once the virus subsides. Power, too, is infectious and spreads like a virus fed by human dominance and superiority. The pandemic has certainly exposed dominant power relations. In the UK, the Institute for Fiscal Studies found that British Black Africans are dying from COVID at more than 3 times the rate of the white population. In Australia, rising levels of homelessness and domestic violence among women are reported. Nadia Al-Ali speaks on the effects of the pandemic in the global south in relation to women, writing that specific risks and vulnerability are associated with intersectional pre-existing inequalities, highlighting the wider challenges faced by LGBTQ people, ethnic minorities, domestic workers, migrants, and sex workers. Considering transnational feminist solidarities, Al-Ali makes clear how, against the backdrop of these gendered intersectional challenges, feminist initiatives and mobilizations that deal with the crisis in specific local contexts are needed, as well as nationally, regionally, and transnationally. This morning, I spoke with GWO editor Banu Oscar Zhang-Pan, who referred to COVID-19 as a never-ending labor. Recognizing and valuing women's labor is central to mitigating the risks that women face during the pandemic. In a forthcoming commentary with Banu on women's value in society, we see racist patriarchy as a shadow pandemic which continues to rely on and exploit women. Women's care work and life-making work after Tithi Bhattacharya continues to be undervalued and unrecognized, making a case for the redefinition of productivity and work. In the pages of Gender, Work and Organization, powerful feminist experiences across geographical, race, sex, class-based differences are being documented. Their embodied realities, including the racism experienced by Chinese women in the UK, the risks to Brazilian domestic workers, women's care work for elderly parents, fear and anxiety and isolation, work intensification and working mothers' exhaustion. Recognizing that women are at great risk from increased unemployment and precarious work, do more formal care work in aged and healthcare, do more unpaid domestic labor, are more often than not the unpaid care worker of children, the sick and the elderly, and do unpaid work in the community is central. Commenting from regions of conflict and crisis, such as the Middle East, Lina Abi Rafi recently called for a reconsideration of women's work that recognizes their contributions and which involves building environments, work environments that builds on the flexibilities that women have demonstrated in lockdown. Government paid care for those who need it is a critical demand. Building feminist communities and economies rely on feminist care and solidarity as embodied relations to address structural inequalities. In an inspirational conversation with Cynthia Enlow, Ash Prasad and Ghazal Zulfikar discussed the role of praxis and resistance in feminist solidarity, where Enlow calls for feminist curiosity and the need to teach students self-reflection, especially the ways in which academics produce students who go on to become complicit in organizational irresponsibility. For today, I take 3 points from Enlow to share with you. 1, to be mindful of the dangers of patriarchal and militaristic ideas in managing the pandemic, which sees manliness as the solution to every challenge. We have enough evidence to suggest that women leaders are managing differently and with much better outcomes. We can also see women labour organisers and new civil society groups making a difference. 2, to look for the ways in which patriarchy persists over time and the ways in which racist patriarchy are at work in the nitty-gritty of our everyday organisational lives. And last, thirdly, we need to face the ways in which women have been among, I quote, the daily legitimizers of feminized practices that normalize gendered racism and gendered ethnocentrism. As Bhattacharya says, after the COVID-19 crisis, capitalism will try to get back to business as usual. Our job is to not let the system forget.
Thank you so much, Alison, for these insightful reflections, and certainly so many things resonate, not least this idea of this patriarchal but also aggressive and masculinist notion of the war on the pandemic, as if those sorts of ideas will be helpful in going forward. And I know that you've written about this with Sheena Vakani recently in relation to feminist leadership and alternative ways of leading that seem to be more effective but also more caring, and in terms of how people in positions of authority are dealing with this. So moving on to our next speaker, Carl, over to you.
I made that very easy trick for new players of not unmuting, but thank you very much, Kate. Like Alison, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, on whose land I both live and work, and also pay my respects to their ancestors and their elders, and acknowledge their ongoing status as the first peoples of this land, which I'm sitting on now. Now, in response to Kate's provocation with this webinar, I want to use this opportunity to talk a little bit of the organizational ethics that I see in place during this time of COVID. And if you think of just before COVID, in January of this year, and before that, just before that, there was actually a lot going on with organizational ethics, you know, before the devastation of the virus. On the 21st of January in particular, the world's elite jetted into the Swiss alpine village of Davos. These were politicians, public figures, business moguls, and various high-minded celebrities. And the focus of the meeting at Davos of the World Economic Forum was on what they specifically referred to as stakeholders for a cohesive and sustainable world. Now, the meeting marked a high tide moment for what some people call woke capitalism. This is a term used to describe the condition where the owners of capital, be they individuals or corporations, have somehow transcended the selfishness of shareholder primacy. They publicly support progressive and ostensibly traditionally left-wing political causes, anything from marriage equality to anti-racism to addressing climate change, as well as take private action on political roles traditionally reserved for the state. And what Davos promised was a whole new zeitgeist. I mean, it had already been announced in 2019 when the Business Roundtable, which is a kind of a US club for big-time CEOs, they'd proclaimed that the purpose of business had somehow fundamentally changed from shareholder primacy to stakeholder capitalism. The question is, amongst all of this, and there was a lot more going on at that time of organizations, business organizations, corporations, making various very big claims as to their social role. So these, you know, do-gooding corporations, where were they when COVID hit just a few months later? Well, effectively, like fair weather friends, big business did very little to make any significant difference. For many of them, come the troubled times, they were lining up the world over, crying poor mouth in hope for some taxpayer-funded government bailouts. Now, for decades, neoliberal dogma had insisted on small government when it came to corporate regulation, welfare, and education. But malignant self-interest is rife when those who fed ferociously from the neoliberal trough were the first in the corporate welfare line, just like they had been before back in 2007. Now, in the lead up to Davos itself, not everyone agreed with this movement to emphasize shareholders. Various right-wing reactionaries had been on their soapboxes decrying woke capitalism as a kind of, corporate capitulation to a leftist ideology. The people who did it were kind of decried as some kind of corporate socialists. But if it wasn't clear before, what COVID's demonstrated is that these reactionary pundits were completely wrong. Take a company like Nike. Now, Nike was in many ways a kind of poster child for woke capitalism. They courted a lot of controversy back in 2018 when they released an ad campaign featuring Colin Kaepernick, the Dream Crazy campaign. Now, this had a very important impact on stimulating public debate about racism and police brutality. But it also did quite a lot to bolster Nike's brand. It actually presaged a $6 billion increase in the company's market value. Now, by comparison, when COVID hit, Nike made a contribution of $15 million. Really quite pathetic in comparison. If you look at some other examples, in the UK, Amazon donated 3.9 million. But bear in mind, over the previous 10 years, they'd avoided 100 billion in tax in that very same period. So really, it's a small difference. The Gates Foundation and Netflix pledged $100 million each. Mark Zuckerberg from Google, he threw in 25 million. But that's chump change when it comes to the vastness of corporate wealth. And it's infinitesimal if you compare it to what's going to be needed to address the health and economic effects of COVID. I mean, one early analysis estimated that the bill would be at least $5 trillion in the United States alone. But in the end, what's really happened is that COVID has been a boon for big corporates and billionaires. Oxfam released a report recently where they refer to this as pandemic profiteering. Now, there are 634 people on the Forbes billionaire list. Since COVID, their wealth has increased by $685 billion US. That's up around 25% to a total of a staggering $3.7 trillion. Now, if there's an ethics involved here, an ethics or associated with this, what we're calling here woke capitalism, it allows for gross inequality. And if that's so, it's an ethics that's very much a corporeal matter, at least in its effect. It's an ethics that preys on the bodies of other people while positioning itself in relation to disembodied righteousness. It emulsifies economic self-interest and moral self-aggrandizement. And while this might all seem like kind of doomsaying on my point, in a sense, COVID, as well as highlighting this, has also planted some seeds of change. In many countries, we saw the retreat of corporations and the market and the return of elected governments in setting the conditions for the future welfare of citizens, for better or for worse. The lesson that COVID offers is that we need to get back to building a future that restores a socially driven democracy for the people. I mean, in the hour of COVID's darkness arises a need to restore hope in a shared prosperity. Does it not cast its face in the fickleness of fair weather corporate friends and the crumbs that drop from their tables? The danger, of course, is that corporations and plutocrats have incorporated a new wave of social awareness into the primary ethos of neoliberal self-interest. But it's this morality that an embodied ethics disrupts, disrupting the passive acceptance of an inevitability of disembodied rational self-interest as the essence of human action and desire. an ethics that emerges from an openness and generosity towards other people rather than the neoliberal ethic of self-interest. One where the self is called into question by other people rather than bolstered in its own sovereignty. I mean, this is a responsibility that calls us to seek and create alternative futures, not endlessly repeating a refrain of self-interest that reproduces social, gendered and racial hierarchies, while all the time paying lip service to the scam of meritocracy. I mean, organizational ethics, we've seen corporates at the big end of town scrambling for power and money as the world got sick. I mean, contra this, maybe COVID can prompt a renewed demand for the disruption that can be given by an embodied ethics. I mean, COVID has shown that the neoliberal experiment has failed to prepare the world for crisis, failed also even for non-crisis time, and that now is the time for a change. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Carl. And two essential reflections. I mean, a lot of our attendees today are teaching business ethics in the places that they work, or teaching CSR, and if anything, this particular moment in history is throwing the truisms of the last 10 years of corporate social responsibility. I mean, you nearly rename your module with a question mark at the end of that if it didn't have a question mark at the end of that CSR phrase already, for that reason. But also more to throw into question, who is the individual at the heart of business ethics? Like you say, who is this subject? Who is this quasi-independent, autonomous individual that we sort of, business ethics theory kind of has us believe is at the heart of these things, and this pandemic is showing us that if anything, we are by no means independent or somehow separated from each other. Hopefully we'll be able to take these up in our discussion. So our next speaker is Professor Ian Munro. I'll pass over to you now, Ian.
Thanks, Kate. I have a short PowerPoint presentation to share. Hello, everyone. So I very much agree with the previous two speakers, Alison and Carl, and what I'm going to say, I think, very much ties in with what issues they've already raised. So the agenda I've got is this idea of this pandemic, the COVID pandemic, to some extent presents a reevaluation of values. That concerns the way in which we look at, of course, capitalism, as Carl mentioned, and also our bodies and issues related to care and solidarity. And I'm going to look at the viral ethics in terms of viral biopolitics, the way populations are managed by governments, and the viral commons, the way in which we live together and care for each other. The health philosopher Georges Canguilhem talked about health as a way of tackling existence. One is not only the possessor or bearer, but also, if necessary, the creator, establisher of vital norms. And Richard Horton, the editor of The Lancet, he actually says, this global calamity is not a crisis concerning health, it's a crisis about life itself, a politics of life and a politics of inequality. The way in which we, of course, interact, the way in which we work, the way in which we care for each other, all of these basic social expectations, values, have all changed massively over the last few months since COVID started. As Carl also mentioned, Richard Horton states that COVID has seen a rebirth of the state, and particularly through, I would say, what I call digital biopolitical interaction, or digital biopolitics. The role of the sort of information technology has intensified massively, and these companies, Amazon, Facebook, Zoom, that we're using right now, they've seen their share prices skyrocket, where the rest of the much of the rest of the economy has suffered catastrophic losses, both in employment and custom. But I've categorized different biopolitical strategies for managing the viral population based on a reading of a number of books on COVID and newspaper articles. One is, Carl already mentioned, the neoliberal response. This is largely based on this idea of laissez-faire state intervention, voluntary social distancing, the primacy of economic relations, primacy of norms of wealth creation, the role of behavioral economics in advisory bodies and so forth. Countries such as the UK, US and Sweden, to a large extent, have taken a neoliberal response. And they often, at the beginning of the crisis, businessmen were asked for their opinion about the effects of COVID and the implications of COVID and so on. And there was a very sort of a classic statement of this by a very prominent, the chairman of a prominent pub chain in the UK, who claimed that COVID should have no real effect on business, on his business, because the virus doesn't circulate in pubs. He stated on Sky News. And this type of, a lot of the misinformation, the World Health Organization talked about an infodemic as well as a pandemic, and that infodemic wasn't just circulated by hostile states. It was largely circulated by members of the business community and, of course, a number of very odd political leaders as well that we've seen making all sorts of strange recommendations for dealing with COVID. But it's a classic laissez-faire response. Now, having said that, their laissez-faire didn't stretch as far as to think, well, I'm going to let my business go. As Carl mentioned, they wanted socialization of, they wanted it's socialism for the rich and privatize, the risks are all individualized, the poor get to suffer and the rich get bailouts. That's what that was. But it's a classic neoliberal response. Another response is the militaristic response. Most countries suspended some laws, some rights, freedom of association, and so on. Also, the right to communicate, freedom of expression, and so these rights have been very heavily policed. The police and military have been granted new powers, and some of this, of course, a lot of this will be for medical reasons and so on, but it's still a militaristic response. And one of the reasons for the relative effectiveness of the Chinese response once they discovered what was going on, although they did attempt to silence early whistleblowers and so on, but they employed military biological warfare units in the front line in Wuhan and so on, which helped manage the COVID population, the potentially viral population. And finally, the medical response. This is based on scientific bodies. Every government has its own scientific bodies. There, of course, is the World Health Organization, which oversees the sort of global, gives advice to governments on how to manage it. And you had, of course, different states, different medical bodies arguing with each other. Famously, in Britain, there is the SAGE group, which the expert body that advises the government, and there's the independent SAGE group. There's another expert body which was set up by another group of scientists, a more diverse group, and so on, which actually offers different advice from the official SAGE group. But there is some overlap between these different strategies. They may be used in more or less different levels in different countries. We've seen a sort of mix of them. But you have seen, as Horton says, a rebirth of the state, particularly with the role of medicine, to some extent the role of the military, and particularly with the use of suspension of rights, increased funding of health, and so on, temporarily. Now, there's also viral apartheid. One of the issues that the two previous speakers have mentioned is this idea of viral apartheid. That there are privileged workers who have been able to use the benefits of information technology. Academics would be one, but the sort of knowledge workers, generally professional classes. And the ones who suffer the most, of course, are the ones at the front line of caring, hospital workers, and so on. And you've seen the vectorial classes, Mackenzie Walk calls it, massive increase in share prices for Amazon, Facebook, Zoom, and so forth. Amazon announcing 100,000 extra jobs. Essential workers, healthcare workers, home care workers, it's bodily enclosed, bodily embodied, proximal, exposed and contaminated work. It's gendered, it's racial. Richard Horton talks about the fact that Black and Asian women in the UK were 4 times more likely to die from COVID-19 compared with their white counterparts. That statistic does come from the Institute of Fiscal Studies, as Alison mentioned. The mortality rate of those in England from the most deprived areas is more than double the rate of those in the least deprived areas. But even there have of course been massive costs related to lockdown, related to treating COVID. The United Nations estimates 15 million extra cases of domestic abuse. And of course, unemployment, suicide, depression, and all a huge number of social costs related to lockdown. So even treating COVID, of course, is massively problematic. The social costs are massively problematic. What happens with, well, you've got individualizing fear of the other, social distancing, self-isolation, contact tracing, and all these things, of course, are further individualizing people. The use of IT to work, increasing use of IT to work. Everyday social interactions have been reduced with family members, colleagues, friends, members of the community. Collective care of the other, practices of home care, healthcare, and so on. Practices of effective solidarity with sick, the exposed and the vulnerable have been problematized because, of course, those who are caring are also in the difficult position of being very at risk and likely to be likely to contract the disease themselves. The biopolitics of care is, Donna Haraway talks about the immune system as a map drawn to guide the recognition and misrecognition of the self and the other in the dialectic of Western biopolitics. It's a misconception to see the self as self-contained, defensive and individualistic. And she discusses the human, frames modern biopolitics in terms of companion species where we infect each other all the time, and calls for Sympoesis, living and dying well together. And this would be the reevaluation of values that Richard Horton and others are calling for, and my colleagues in the webinar today. The reevaluation of values that demands that we see ourselves as companion species, and how do we live and die well together? So conclusions: viral reevaluation of values. You have different strategies of viral biopolitics for population management. We live in a viral commons, and that viral commons is constituted by practices of care, solidarity, conviviality, and living and dying well together. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ian. Incredibly detailed and rich analysis of where we are now from your reading. And thank you so much for this. We'll be able to take up some of these points which cross over in some ways with what others have said. So our next speaker now is Professor Mariana Fataki, and I'll pass over to you, Mariana.
Hi to everyone. So many thanks to Kate and Whitaker Institute. I had the pleasure to hold the fellowship 10 years ago. So lovely to return to Whitaker even in this form. So I'm just going to I will try to avoid repeating what my colleagues, friends, and collaborators have already said, and I will focus actually on the very embodied aspect of COVID. And I have kind of thought that COVID is a great accelerator. It had brought to the fore issues we were aware of, but somehow succeeded, both individually and collectively, societally and organizationally, succeeded to actually avoid coming to terms with. And one of such things is that we are all really sharing that precariousness as human beings, basically, and COVID had brought that to the fore. And it brought to the fore some other things as well, which is that is shared precariousness as part of human conditions. Put bluntly, we are all susceptible to disease, infirmness, and dying, but it also brought to the fore how this precarity is unequally distributed, socially produced, embedded, and reproduced. And here I take an inspiration, not only from my medical background, which is always informing my thinking and it's the back of my mind, but also what has been a journey for me within academia and in my minute and small activist practice, the thinking from feminist theories and feminist practice, obviously. So what I was just trying to, I'm using terminology that Judith Butler made actually kind of available to all of us. And I think that starting from, and I will not repeat really what my colleague said, but starting from the fact that within our small settings, within our bubble, as I call academia, we have noticed, for example, that we have a increase in submissions by our male colleagues and decrease in submissions over COVID by our female colleagues. What does it mean? Well, very simply, it means that actually many female colleagues are still having the privilege of actually performing care in disproportionate actually amount. So that's one of the aspects how that COVID has translated into our own settings. But more than that, we can actually see how that unequal distribution of precarity affects our planet on the in terms of speciality, right? So, for example, I was only reading very recently that India actually suffers the highest recession since it became an independent country, 26%. It's close to actually what the UK experiences, but still it's much higher. And in India's terms, it means like almost 200 million people will be put back to extreme poverty through COVID. So that precarity is really not only unequally distributed within gender, race, and geography, but within our own societies, which is the most important things. What can we do as academics, and what do we do actually, as society, in how we deal with that inequality that has been there before, but now it can be no longer, I would argue, ignored. So, for example, recently I also read that our politicians said that in the UK, as a matter of fact, actually statement of fact, that in the UK, in the poorer areas, COVID will turn to be an endemic condition. Not only we have a triple or quadruple mortality and in these areas, but actually somehow this becomes a normalized condition. Further on from that is how do we deal with that unequal precarity? And that's the most interesting point where our role as academics is super important in my personal view. So how do we deal? Well, in the usual style, by othering the victim, right? And by not recognizing in that way, by in terms of geography, by distancing ourselves from these people so they become unrecognizable and unrelatable to ourselves. They have strange cultural habits and they are just basically not like us, to cut the very long story short, but it is within our societies that we see people who are not like us. So for example, a minister not so long ago in the UK, a minister not so long ago said, well, the higher mortality in black and ethnic communities in the UK is due to their unhealthy lifestyles. You see, these people are actually not living healthy lifestyles. They're fatter, they don't eat healthy food, and therefore, by implication, the higher mortality is their own responsibility. And that is a legacy of long responsibilization that has started in the UK, in stigmatization and holding actually, you know, certain groups of population, ever increasing groups of population responsible for their own lifestyles and their own plight, which is actually socially reproduced. Because the first thing to go in austerity, what is the first thing to go? Well, disability benefits, for example, in these countries, right? And social credit is the first thing that actually is actually falls a victim to any austerity policies. So it's, whilst I agree with everything that my colleague said, I will just only say, it's not about reevaluating our values, but it's actually bringing them to the fore, talking about issues of socially reproduced inequalities and injustices, which have always been there, but we somehow managed to ignore them in this bubble of actually larger societal bubble of consumerism and market as and marketized discourse, which is part of obviously neoliberal hegemony and ideology, which is the only game in town now. So bringing that back to the fore, and I will conclude my actually short intervention by saying, what is the role of academics in that situation? So I want to pay tribute here to the untimely deceased David Graeber, who not only is an inspiration for his incisive and innovative and inspirational work in terms of this is the first man who wrote a history of death. How could there be no history of death? That's an interesting thing from anthropological perspective. But more close to home, he spoke about bullshit jobs. That is, jobs actually that not only do not contribute to society, but actually stand in the way of society's progress. And these are the usually well-paid jobs, whilst the jobs that are necessary, like COVID again, the great accelerator has brought that to the fore. Jobs like cleaners, bus drivers, nurses, delivery people. These are the low-paid jobs, but the essential jobs that if they are not performed, society comes to the halt. So how do we position ourselves in that continuum of bullshit jobs? Because I think there is a lot of actually, there is as part of neoliberal hegemony, our meaningful jobs that have to do with actually making young people able to think, giving them tools to think and critically assess rather than cramming them with useless knowledge, or useful knowledge, which will anyway become redundant in 5 to 10 years' time, whilst their critical ability, which we're supposed to instill in them, will not become redundant. So how do we oppose that our own jobs don't become bullshit jobs? Because I'm talking about academia here. I don't think it's enough just to describe, although it's super important to describe and highlight. I think, and I want to make a call here, that if we want our academic jobs not to become bullshit jobs, we need to be engaged in activist practice with people who do the real job out there and make our job real and meaningful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mariana, and for these insightful comments, which translate to some of the things that people have spoken about, and maybe now we can draw out some of these issues. Alison, if I may, you made a point that has stuck with me around the idea that the introspection gained during this particular period will be lost after. And I think it's one of these senses we get that we are in a particular time and place where certain things that each of the panel members have talked about as situations of gross inequality have come to the fore. But we will forget as things become segmented after. From the position of, from sort of feminist ethics and the idea of social reproduction, the idea of that we exist in no matter what flavor of social democracy or political economy we're talking about, we're in the idea that there's an entire body of work that remains unpaid and yet supports the capitalist economy in which we are working, particularly in Western countries. To what extent are demands or claims for these sorts of inequalities to be rectified? Are you seeing anything like this that may allow us to continue on beyond this point in terms of the care work that people are doing, the unpaid labour that goes into sustaining the economy, often the unpaid labour hugely frequently of women that goes into sustaining the economy. Are you seeing anything coming out that may look like something sustainable?
Well, thanks, Kate. I think there's decades of learning and work that's been done from the 60s onwards by feminists who we continue to draw on and who've given us the tools to work with. I think what's happened in the context in which I work, in a business school context, is that I think we've taken for granted our relative privileges, and we haven't been, or I haven't been working with community groups and civil organizations that allow us to intervene in practical terms. But I think rather than giving women more work to do, we need to see people making the structural changes that allow more women to get back to work after COVID, and that relies on governments to provide sufficient resources for free childcare and other forms of care, which in a privileged society like Australia, we're not seeing. We're actually seeing cuts to women's welfare and packages that make it unsustainable for women to return to work. Now, if we want to recover after COVID, and I'm speaking very confidently talking about after COVID, I don't think it's going anywhere for some time, then governments need to be working with organizations and making them accountable for providing the resources that's embedded in the infrastructure of all organizations.
Thank you very much for this. I just wanted to ask a question of Ian, because Ian, your work has of late looked very much at sort of the idea of resistance via information technology. So studying, for example, the Panama Papers, journalists using technology to communicate, studying WikiLeaks as repository. To what extent do people need bodies to resist? So, I mean, in terms of, do you see any sorts of resistance to the issues that you've spoken about that can be utilized or that can go down the medium of information technology? Or are you more inclined, we have a long history of civil disobedience as involving the placing of the body in the public space, whether non-violent or other forms of protest. Is the body needed for resistance, do you think?
Absolutely. The whole issue of care and social reproduction that Alison, everybody's raised actually, is fundamental to solidarity and forms of autonomy and creation of alternative forms of organizing and resistance. So I think the body and yeah, this issue of social reproduction is fundamental. But also IT, because you've got misinformation, and you've got this neoliberal hegemonic sort of system that Carl mentioned as well, which is sort of teaching us how to live, from where to become consumers, to ignore the ones who we don't see, we don't care for, we put away, and so on. That's all. Yeah, I think there has to be absolutely embodied resistance, but there also has to be a reappropriation of the means of knowledge production and communication, and the university would certainly be very much part of that. And that all has to be how to do it. Of course, is difficult. In the case of COVID, we had some interesting examples in terms of a few interesting whistleblowers who not only in China, of course, where a very vital source of information, but in the National Health Service, people talking out about the lack of PPE and all sorts of things going on, which is all very important part of the role of IT, not just for Zoom and continuing work, but finding out things that we desperately need to find out about in order to exercise autonomy and collective solidarity.
So hopefully debates around education and how this might change will address some of these. Just a final question for Carl, following the idea of woke capitalism and these demands on corporates. And it's kind of interesting in the context of the US. This particular country has often, drawing on the more libertarian side of things, has broken up monopolies in the past, where it's seen that they are getting in the way of the individual entrepreneur, the small business, who is, so, you know, with AT&T in the oil industry and things like this. And yet now we have these monopolies that very much govern sort of how we buy, how we consume information and those sorts of things. But the scale of wealth on the part of their owner almost kind of is as never before, as you pointed out. And so, you know, are we in uncharted territory in terms of how political systems might actually effectively deal with this through the traditional methods of law and regulation?
I did it again. To some extent, I think we are. I mean, if there's a parallel, it would be a parallel between, you know, the US robber barons of the so-called Gilded Age of post-Civil War America. And so there's many similarities, I think, between extreme wealth now and extreme wealth at that time. I think there is a difference, as I was saying, that there's much more of a moralization of inequality today than perhaps there was at that time. And even though that was also a golden age of philanthropy, as we're going through another similar phase now with kind of massive foundations created by tech billionaires, back then they were supporting, you know, arts and humanities in museums and universities, but now it's about, you know, much more, again, traditionally kind of left kind of causes. So I think it's quite different. I mean, but how to kind of disrupt that is extraordinarily difficult, especially because in liberal democracies, you know, many governments for decades have been hand in hand with these things. I mean, we've seen calls here in Australia recently, for example, a call to rapidly increase tax cuts so that we can spend our way out of the COVID problems. Now, the idea that the market is the resolution to everything, which again is a kind of neoliberal mantra, is just being resurrected. So I think it's really important that we debate these issues, and much of, I think, what academics can do in terms of activism is to try more and more to enter the public sphere and influence debates and discussions that are going on in ways that otherwise wouldn't have done. I mean, of course, we can also potentially organize, you know, protests and actions, but that's not the stuff we're good at. You know, we're trained in speaking and writing. So I think it's from that basis that we can try and influence debates.
Thanks for that, Carl. I know the work of many of everybody on the panel is very much geared towards this. What each of you seem to me to share is an unusual dedication both to theory and philosophy, but also to academic activism through your writing and contributing in the media. So we have some questions coming in through the Q&A, and we probably won't have time to answer all of them, but looking at one of the initial ones, and the questioner notes that something springs to mind in terms of embodiment and organization, and asks, mental health, COVID-19 seems to have brought mental health issues into sharp focus, with home working, family demands, loneliness, loss of freedom, personal loss seem to add to this. How do the panel see employing organizations in relation to this mental health epidemic? And Mariana, I was wondering, given that your background in health, but also your writing on the issue of mental health, and to what extent is this a pandemic of anxiety, and to what extent do organizations play a role in exacerbating and or providing assistance with relations to this?
Okay, thank you, Kate. So what I will say here, of course, as Ian correctly said, we have infodemic, right? And there has been, I recently read a piece of research which suggests that actually reading and being bombarded all the time with information which changes so quickly about COVID, and we face such big uncertainty anyway, impacts has a negative impact on our mental health, including loneliness, not being separated from family, etc. But I think I want to stress something more important here, which again has to do with how our neoliberal states, especially in the UK where I'm located, denudes actually and hollows the capacities of the state. So then the state can be criticized, of course, for being inefficient. So in case of mental health, we follow the Uberization of mental health really by it being outsourced actually to companies like Babylon, right? To come, we have testing related to COVID, not to mental health, but to COVID, outsourced to hedge funds, right? Deloitte, etc. So I mean, as if nothing is happening. Indeed, it is actually, well, I'm not a Marxist, but I have been rethinking some of the Marxist ideas. But especially when capitalism faces that acute crisis, as it does face it at the moment, with people realizing that shared precarity can be a source of strength and solidarity, like in Black Lives Matter, right? People actually, we never seen so many, well, if I may use that terminology, non-Black people, white people, actually joining and joining the Black Lives Matter. So anyway, so the capitalism is really facing, a potentiality that we can use that shared precariousness, that COVID made us aware of, to actually organize, and then, of course, it redoubles or multiplies its efforts to actually respond in the same way. So when there is an increased need for mental health services, we face an assault on availability, like in the same way that Alison was describing, actually, in terms of childcare and various organizational structures. So we really need to make this actually, I would say, become aware of that and publicize that in non-academic channels necessarily, so people are really aware that that's what's going on. Sorry, I'm not sure that I answered exactly what Laura was asking, but I thought that this is a super important point that needs to be made. Thank you.
I mean, thank you very much. And I think on that, it relates to a second question that came up and that I think people have been speaking about in relation to, there was a question raised around the idea of the commons and the notion that this word, the commons, has been used more and more as a replacement for the word public to stand in for the social. And the questioner asks, how should we read this idea of the commons under conditions where public institutions have become, over 3 past decades, unbundled and rebraided into private property and equity owners' interests? And they have different stakes and stakeholders naturally alongside different types of responsibilization of vulnerable individuals. So how does this unbundling, or this move from commons, from public to commons, affect the way we should read the meaning of the viral and the commons? And this kind of very much relates to what people have been saying around potential for awareness of precarity, awareness of shared existence, awareness of our bodies inevitably and inescapably dependent upon each other for better or for worse, and whether this idea of the commons can help us to sort of rethink this. Don't know if anyone has thoughts on that. There's Ian waving. Yes.
Thanks. It's a great question. Well, I have 2 books on my desk right here which address exactly this point. One is Richard Horton, the editor of The Lancet, and he talks about the role of the state and the important role of the state in providing vital public services, as the questioner correctly, absolutely vital. Whether it be mental health care, healthcare concerning the treatment of pandemic, absolutely the role of funding care in society. Yes, it should absolutely be a part of the public funded state issue. The commons is not to do with the state. It's certainly not. I think there's a slight misinterpretation of the notion of commons by the questioner. There's another book here by Silvia Federici, This is Re-Enchanting the World, Feminism and the Politics of the Commons. And she says that, well, the thing about the commons is essentially grounded in social reproduction. Social reproduction is the production of care, the production of the commons, whether it be social relationships, the environment, knowledge, it's all social reproduction. And this is not necessarily undertaken privately or publicly in terms of the state. It could be, but it is this notion that it's often unpaid, as Alison and so on has stated. But that needs, it could have state funding, it could have funding from any number of sources, I suppose. But the fact is that it's work, it's important, vital work for, and this, as everyone has raised, is really become sort of, with the epidemic, we've seen a whole number of crises related to the epidemic, whether it be actual health or mental health or unemployment or whatever. But this idea of the commons, the organization of the commons, is fundamental to social reproduction, to caring relations in society. But both the commons and the public we need to rethink about the vital role of these in our organizations. Neoliberalism, as Carl has correctly diagnosed, is a disaster that's benefiting very, very few, ongoing disaster.
Thanks, Ian. And I have to say, I think it was my garbled interpretation of the question rather than the questioner's interpretation of the commons that led to the discrepancy. I believe that what the questioner was pointing out was exactly this, that the state excludes as much as it includes, and is certainly not the answer to this in terms of, but certainly a key part of the debate. I'm afraid now we're running near time, and I'm going to have to wind up the event. But you know, I guess from my perspective, from our perspective here at the Whitaker Institute, you know, the COVID situation, the pandemic, and how we find ourselves, it's going to be years before we know what is being written and what is being experienced. And we know the outcomes and we know the implications of it. But I find it really, really helpful to have listened to each of you, because to take stock at this moment and to hear these various perspectives on what we are experiencing, giving us all some very valuable food for thought. So sincere thanks to our 4 panelists today. Really appreciate you taking the time to come on. And massive thanks to the team at the Whitaker Institute, Courtney, Angela, and to Megan Van Poortvliet as well for helping us with this webinar. And huge thanks to our participants and our attendees, and for the questions. Fortunately, we didn't get to all of them, but we appreciate them very much. Well, we hope to see you back here at some point in the future. And with that, we'll say goodbye. Thank you very much.